My name is Colonel Penelope Ward. I'm a military medic, 20 years in service, 17 in the field, 10 of those on the front lines. I've stitched up wounds in sandstorms, delivered babies in tents under shell fire, and treated trauma so violent it stayed under my fingernails for weeks. I never cared for medals. I cared for the breath after resuscitation. The moment when a soldier opens their eyes and realizes they're still here. But nothing in my training prepared me for the humiliation I faced. In a ballroom full of brass and bloodlines. The gala was held at Fort Lunsford's Grand Hall, polished marble floors, gold banners, strings playing chamber music like we hadn't all crawled through dust and death. It was the kind of night where you either wore your uniform like a shield or a mask. I wore mine with pride. The medals pinned to my chest weren't for display. They were for Staff Sergeant Mendez, who bled out in my arms, for Specialist Avery, who took shrapnel to the eye, and still found the strength to call her mom. I didn't come to be seen. I came because I was invited, by command. I hadn't expected to see my family there. I spotted them near the central arch, my mother adjusting her pearl necklace, my sister Olivia with her carefully curled hair, and Carson, my older brother. Former intelligence, now civilian defense consultant, still walking like the army owed him something. I approached quietly, nodded. Before I could speak, Carson turned and looked me over, his lip curled with something between smugness and disgust. Then he said it. "Stop acting like a nurse, Penny. This isn't your ER." The words hit harder than any mortar round. I looked at him, at his crisp suit, at the martini in his hand, and the smile, the one that always said, "You don't belong here." He said it loud enough for the couple beside him to hear, and soft enough to make sure I'd be the one who looked dramatic if I responded. I didn't flinch. I faced gunfire that had better aim. Behind him, I saw someone else, a young man in a dark suit, seated near the corner. His wheelchair was almost camouflaged against the black and silver decor. His face was pale, his eyes empty. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He wasn't being spoken to. I recognized him. Lieutenant Nathan Beckett, combat engineer, severely injured by an IED in Syria, son of General Harlan Beckett, 4-star. I knew his file, but more than that, I knew that look. It was the look of a soldier who came home, but left himself behind. I turned away from Carson without a word, crossed the room in full view of the crowd. Some people stopped talking, a few stared. I knelt beside Nathan, he startled, but not violently. Just enough to show he wasn't used to kindness anymore. I asked gently, "Would you like to dance?" He blinked. I waited. At first he didn't answer. His hand twitched slightly in his lap, like the memory of motion still lived inside the nerves. A slow, uncomfortable silence built around us, richer than the music. Then, he nodded. No one helped him. I didn't lift him, I just stood and offered my hand. He grabbed the side of his chair and pushed. The effort was clumsy. His leg brace slipped slightly as he shifted forward. He grunted. I waited. And then, he rose. Not fully, but enough. He placed one foot carefully in front of the other. His hand found mine, not for balance, but for presence. I didn't guide him. We moved slowly. One shuffle, a breath, another shuffle. My uniform boots echoed with his mechanical step. The orchestra didn't change tempo, but the room did. People noticed. A woman gasped. The ballroom had fallen into stillness. Carson stared, his glass frozen midair. My mother moved slightly backward, her eyes searching for someone to explain what was happening. My sister looked pale. The string quartet continued, a haunting melody, violin swelling beneath the weight of meaning no one had rehearsed for. Nathan's hand tightened on mine, not in fear, but in resolve. His brow furrowed. He looked up, not at me, but past me. Then, slowly, he began to turn. Just a quarter spin. Unbalanced. But it was him, choosing motion. Him, choosing the next step. And I followed. We didn't finish a waltz, but we finished something else. Nathan exhaled deeply, nodded once, and lowered himself back into his chair. His eyes, once hollow, now shimmered with something dangerously close to hope. I straightened my uniform, adjusted my collar. The silence remained. Then footsteps. Measured, heavy, General Harlan Beckett crossed the floor like a man caught between military protocol and personal grief. His chest was full of stars, but his eyes were full of water. He stopped in front of us. The room held its breath. He looked at his son, then at me, and then, with a voice hoarse and cracking beneath generations of discipline, he said, "Colonel, you just saved my son's life." I didn't smile, I simply nodded. Behind me, my family froze, speechless. For the first time, Carson had nothing to say. The ride home was quiet, but not the good kind of quiet. The kind that simmers just beneath boiling, ready to spill. The kind that makes the air inside a luxury SUV feel like a pressure cooker. I sat behind the driver, staring at my reflection in the tinted window. The metal bars on my chest glinted faintly with the city lights flickering past. I didn't adjust them. I let them sit crooked. The silence cracked as soon as the driver closed the door. My mother was the first to speak. "Well, that was inappropriate," she said, smoothing the silk scarf around her neck, like it had been ruffled by shame itself. I didn't answer. I kept looking out the window. She leaned forward slightly in her seat, her voice sharp. "You couldn't have just sat and clapped politely? Did you really need to turn that poor wounded boy into a spectacle?" I turned my head, just a bit. Enough for her to see the side of my face, not enough to offer anything she could read. "Do you think General Beckett invited you to show off? You embarrassed him. You embarrassed us." I didn't blink. The car rolled to a red light. Outside, a group of young cadets laughed near a bus stop. Civilian clothes, casual swagger. They looked weightless. Then came Carson. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. His tone was clipped, cold, as always. "You planned that, didn't you? You read his file. You wanted to make a move in front of a 4-star. My stomach tightened, not in shock, but from the familiarity of it. Carson always believed ambition was dirtier when it came from someone like me. He could climb ladders. I was supposed to mop the floor beneath them. I still didn't respond. He kept going. "You choreographed the whole thing. That wasn't medicine. That was theater. You've always wanted to be the exception, the story, the hero. The army doesn't need medics who perform. It needs soldiers who follow orders." That last word landed hard. Follow. It reminded me of a day on a forward operating base in Kandahar, 6 years ago. We got word a village kid had stepped on something near the wire, probably an old mine. I was closest. I ran. When I reached him, he was still breathing, legs mangled, crying in Pashto for his mother. I started the tourniquets. I radioed for evac. And then command called me back. "Stand down, Colonel. He's not our mission." Not our mission. The boy bled out in my arms before I even made it back across the line. I wrote his name in my journal that night. I didn't know how to spell it. I just drew the shape of his face. I had followed orders, and he had died. Tonight, I didn't follow. I let someone lead. Back in the car, Carson's voice cut again. "I spoke with your CO 2 weeks ago. Word is, they're reviewing your post-field eligibility. Some think you're not suited for high-visibility ops anymore. You're a liability." I finally turned to him, slowly. "I didn't know you still checked in on me." He blinked. That surprised him, not because it was true, but because it wasn't angry. He scoffed and looked out his own window. Mom chimed in again. "We're not trying to tear you down, Penelope. We just don't want you to keep drawing the wrong kind of attention." I smiled at the glass. The wrong kind. That's what they called it when I applied to Ranger School. When I turned down Carson's offer to work in private defense. When I stayed enlisted instead of going civilian for more money. The wrong kind of attention. "I didn't do it for attention," I said quietly. "Then why?" Carson snapped. I could have said because Nathan's eyes reminded me of that boy on the dirt. I could have said because I didn't want another name I couldn't spell etched in my memory, but I didn't. Instead I said, because I was there, and I saw him, and no one else did. Carson scoffed again. "You keep thinking you're different. That makes you dangerous. Dangerous." I turned back to the window. This time, my reflection stared directly at me. I remembered the moment Nathan stood, his trembling hand in mine, the screech of his brace against the floor, the hush of the room like everyone's breath had been vacuumed into a single second. That wasn't theater. That was life. "Do you know what the general said to me?" I asked. Neither of them answered. He said, "Colonel, you just saved my son's life." Silence again, except this time it belonged to me. After I got home that night, I didn't bother changing out of my dress uniform. I unpinned the medals and laid them carefully on my desk. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, the faint hum of the heater buzzing like a distant wasp in my ears. I wasn't thinking about the Gala anymore. I was back there again. Forward Operating Base, Mitchell, Southern Afghanistan. Dry heat, red dust in your lungs. That place still lived in the corners of my body, tucked into old scar tissue and behind my left shoulder where the shrapnel had gone in. It was late afternoon. The light was harsh. I remember the sandbags stacked around the medical tent like weak promises. I just finished cleaning the dressing on Sergeant Mullen's chest wound when the first round hit. Mortar, maybe 70 meters out. The next one landed closer. We had 4 injured already inside the tent. 1 unconscious, 1 intubated. 2 corpsmen shouted for me. We were low on morphine. The generator for the AC had failed earlier that morning. The third explosion collapsed part of the north fence. And that's when I heard it. A scream. It wasn't loud, but it was different, raw, desperate. It came from outside the tent, somewhere near the triage zone. I stepped out and saw him, a young private, bleeding from the abdomen, pinned beneath a chunk of broken structure. There was no one else out there. Protocol said to stay under cover. Reinforcements were already en route. It was a matter of minutes, but I moved anyway. I sprinted low, kept my head down. I could feel the vibration of each round in the soles of my boots. I reached him and dropped to my knees, hands instinctively checking for pulse, breath, responsiveness. His name was Lindley, 19. He kept saying, "Please don't leave me." I didn't plan to. I wedged my shoulder under the debris, braced, and pushed. My leg screamed. I'd torn something, but I kept pushing until it shifted enough to drag him out. We were halfway back to the tent when it happened. Another blast. Everything spun white and red. I woke up 6 hours later in the surgical bay of a mobile hospital. My leg was splinted. I had a grade 3 concussion and 3 fractured ribs. Mullins had survived. So had Lindley. I hadn't. At least not in the way I used to exist. For 6 weeks, I lay in a recovery cot. No visitors, just check-ins and charts. Most of my team had rotated out. I heard from some nurses, a chaplain. Even Lindley wrote me a note that said, "You gave me another birthday." But Carson? He sent an email. No call, no visit, just a message. "Don't blow this up. You got hurt doing something reckless. That doesn't make you a hero, it makes you stupid. Stay quiet. Let it pass." I remember staring at the screen for a long time, then I deleted it. I told myself he was just being Carson. Tough love, misguided protection. But I knew better. His contempt for me hadn't started with that email. It had just learned to speak louder, and I had learned to stay quieter. After I got discharged, I didn't go home. I stayed on base, filed the after-action reports, took the psych evals, passed the physical requal 6 weeks ahead of schedule. No one said much, except for one lieutenant colonel who told me, "You're not built like most." He meant it as a compliment. I carried it like a warning. For a while, I tried to believe it wasn't personal, that Carson's coldness was his way of coping, that being the older brother had made him hard, that maybe he thought I made him look small. But deep down, I understood. His disdain wasn't an accident. It wasn't emotional distance or male pride. It was structural. He didn't believe I belonged. Not in the field, not in the uniform, not at the table. He thought I was a story that got lucky, a medic who stumbled her way into a few medals and a job she didn't deserve. He'd say it wasn't gender, but every sentence he spoke was soaked in it. He said I was reckless. He said I sought attention. He said I didn't understand real war, and I let him say it for years. But that ended tonight, because when I reached out to Nathan Beckett, I didn't perform, I didn't disobey, I didn't grandstand. I saw someone no one else saw. And for once, someone saw me too. That 7-word sentence from General Beckett, those weren't words of flattery. They were recognition. For the first time in a long time, someone in that rank looked at me and didn't see a nurse who wandered onto the battlefield. They saw a colonel who'd earned every step. 3 days after the gala, a plain white envelope arrived at my quarters. No markings, no insignia. Just my name in block letters. I opened it slowly, careful not to crease it. Inside was a folded note, typed and signed at the bottom. Colonel Ward, I would be honored if you joined us at Walter Reed next Friday to speak with a group of young officers currently undergoing rehabilitation. Your presence and your example made a difference. General Harlan Beckett. I reread the words 3 times. The invitation wasn't a command. It wasn't filtered through a superior officer or dressed up in military formality. It was personal and genuine. For a long moment, I didn't move. My fingers stayed wrapped around the envelope like it might vanish if I blinked. Then I folded it, placed it inside the back cover of my field notebook, and exhaled. The next day, I got a phone call. It wasn't from my commanding officer. It wasn't from anyone at Walter Reed. It was from Carson. He didn't even bother to greet me. "What the hell are you doing, Penny?" I didn't answer. I just let him speak. "I heard you're planning to go to Walter Reed to give a speech. To stand there like some decorated war hero and pretend you're the model officer." Still, I said nothing. He kept going. "Do you even realize how damaging that is? You're not just putting yourself in the spotlight. You're dragging the family name into it. We're under review for 2 defense contracts. You think it helps that my sister is out there playing savior for a general's crippled son?" I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten, but I held. "Carson," I said slowly, "I didn't do anything for the cameras." He laughed, short, bitter. "No, but the cameras followed anyway. And now everyone's calling you the miracle medic, the Beckett whisperer. You really think that's gonna go unnoticed?" That's when I understood. It wasn't about me being dangerous. It was about me being visible. Carson always preferred me invisible. Useful in private, ignorable in public. "I'm going," I said calmly. He snapped. "Well, then don't be surprised if things start unraveling for you, Colonel." And then he hung up. That night, I got a message from my CO. It wasn't accusatory, but it was cautious. "Ward, heads up. There's been some chatter. Someone's flagged a few lines from your Kandahar report. Language suggesting you disobeyed a directive. Not formal, just internal circulation. Be smart." I didn't need to ask where it came from. I already knew. The next morning, 2 different news outlets published articles online. Low-tier, clickbait headlines. Vague accusations. Field medic or liability. Colonel's heroism questioned after Gala spotlight. Controversy behind the uniform. The real story of Penelope Ward. They referenced anonymous sources, took old mission reports out of context, and quoted a former soldier, unnamed, claiming I'd once jeopardized a unit by acting without clearance. There was no proof, but there didn't need to be. That was the play. Carson knew the system. He didn't need to get me reprimanded. He just needed to make the waters muddy enough that I couldn't stand tall in them. He wanted to drown me in suggestion, and it might have worked. A few years ago, it would have worked. But not anymore. I wasn't going to shrink. Not after everything I'd climbed through. Not after seeing Nathan Beckett stand up in front of hundreds of strangers just to take a single step. I knew what I had done. I knew what I hadn't. And I knew what silence cost. I emailed General Beckett that afternoon. "Sir, I accept your invitation. I will be honored to meet your officers. Colonel P. Ward, I didn't CC my CO. I didn't notify public affairs. I packed my bag quietly, printed my deployment files, and requested 2 days of personal leave. Then I called my friend from the legal office. Do me a favor, I said. Check who accessed my personnel file this week." There was a pause. Then she replied, "You already know, don't you?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Yes," I said. "But I need proof." I've learned over the years that the truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it leaves a digital trail. It took less than 36 hours to confirm what I already suspected. Carson hadn't just made a phone call or passed around a few half-truths. He'd been working behind the scenes for months, aligning himself with a coalition of defense contractors and conservative policymakers, quietly campaigning against the full integration of military medical personnel in frontline operations. Their argument? That medics, especially female officers in combat-adjacent roles, weakened unit cohesion and blurred operational clarity. I'd seen echoes of it in passing. Op-eds with veiled language, congressional hearings with concerns about deployment boundaries. But I hadn't realized how close it had gotten until I saw my name in one of their internal memos. It wasn't public, not yet. But a friend in defense affairs, someone I'd once trained in field trauma care, flagged it for me under the radar. The memo listed 3 names: Colonel P. Ward, Lieutenant T. Sims, Major R. Levy. All 3 of us were military medics. All 3 had been decorated for valor in the past decade. And all 3 had been featured, briefly, in Department of Defense outreach videos promoting advanced combat medicine. According to the memo, we were cases of inflated field presence and examples of operational risk introduced by cross-functional ambiguity. I read that sentence 5 times. Cross-functional ambiguity. That was the term they use for saving lives under fire. My hands didn't shake. I'd seen worse, heard worse, but something beneath my ribs pulled tight. Not fear, not even anger, something else, something colder. Carson wasn't just trying to silence me. He was helping build a narrative to erase people like me entirely. I needed evidence, not emotion. So I started documenting, quietly, methodically. I tracked financial disclosures, followed connections between think tanks and contractors, made notes about article timing and keywords. I pulled statements from minor forums, comments made on record by people tied to Carson's consulting firm. I did all of this without leaking, without ranting, without letting anyone see me flinch. I didn't need headlines. I needed the truth to stack neatly and undeniably. What I hadn't expected was the email. It came through a secure server. No name, no greeting, just a single line. He did the same to me, and worse. Attached was a scanned PDF, divorce filings, settlement documents, non-disclosure clauses. At first, I thought it was spam, until I recognized the name, Mira Stanton Ward, Carson's ex-wife. I hadn't heard her name in years. They'd split 5 years ago, quietly, without scandal. The family had brushed it aside, said it was amicable. But Mira had disappeared after that, left D.C., took a job in nonprofit health, and didn't attend a single holiday gathering. I opened the file. It included spreadsheets of financial control, how Carson had limited her access to joint accounts, restricted what she could spend, and even manipulated her medical insurance coverage during the divorce proceedings. There were emails, too, ones where he threatened to ruin her professionally if she spoke publicly about the marriage. And buried in the middle was a short forwarded thread, a message Carson had sent to a colleague 3 months ago. If we can discredit Penelope at the symposium, we'll have enough momentum to shut down the pilot program at Walter Reed. Too much noise around female combat medics lately. She's the symbol. Take her down, the narrative dies. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because I finally had what I needed. Not hearsay, not suspicion. Proof. Still, something didn't sit right. I emailed back. Why now? The reply came quickly. Because I watched your speech at the gala, and because you didn't flinch. She signed it this time. Mira. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't solidarity, but it was enough. Enough to know I wasn't the only one who had been dismissed, undermined, treated as disposable by a man who wore power like armor. I compiled the files, redacted what needed redacting, verified sources. Then I made one final copy of the full report and delivered it in person to the Office of the Inspector General. No press, no flair, just the truth. Then I drove to Walter Reed, folded the General's letter in my coat pocket, and walked through the main doors without looking back. Walter Reed didn't feel like a hospital, not in the usual sense. It breathed like a battlefield, quiet but alert, filled with people who'd seen the edge of everything and were still learning how to come back from it. The walls smelled faintly of antiseptic and stubbornness, the kind that refuses to be written off. The rehab wing was bright, natural light, soft-colored walls. But the most striking thing was the sound, or the lack of it. No one cried, no one screamed. But there was effort in the air. Every breath, every stretch, every clenched jaw said, "We're still here." Nathan saw me first. He was across the room, balancing between parallel bars. His uniform had been replaced by standard rehab gear, loose shirt, fitted brace, soft-soled shoes. His father stood a respectful distance away, arms folded, not interfering. Nathan's eyes caught mine. He didn't smile, not yet, but he nodded. That was enough. I joined the physical therapy team on the edge of the mats. I didn't wear my uniform, just a plain navy shirt and slacks. No rank, no bars. Just the memory of who I was when I started this work, and the promise of who I'd be now that I was returning to it. I didn't give orders, I didn't demonstrate. I sat with a small group, officers, specialists, enlisted, men and women, some missing limbs, others struggling to use the ones they still had. Each of them carried more than physical pain. You could see it in their posture, in the way they hesitated before moving, like their bodies were asking for permission from something their minds couldn't name. I didn't interrupt that silence. Instead, I told them a story. Not about war, not about medals, but about a child I'd once treated. Burns across half his face, too afraid to look in a mirror. He wouldn't walk, not because he couldn't, but because he believed anyone who saw him would run. So every day, I walked beside him. Not in front, not behind, beside. Until one day he let go of my sleeve. I ended the story there. No dramatic conclusion, just the truth. Nathan was listening. He wasn't sitting anymore. He'd taken 2 steps since I arrived. Unsteady, but forward. By the 3rd step, his arms trembled. I moved closer, but not to hold him, only to make sure he knew I saw him. He gritted his teeth. Sweat formed along his hairline. Another step. He looked at me, then at the floor. His voice was barely above a whisper. "This one hurts," I nodded. "Then it's working," he blinked. Then took another step, and another. The room stilled. Not in awe, but in respect. Pain is common in this place, but progress is sacred. Nathan reached the end of the bars, turned slowly. His father remained still. I didn't say anything. I just gave him space to feel what he needed to feel. Then someone behind me spoke. It was a young lieutenant I hadn't met yet. She was maybe 24. Short cropped hair, missing her left hand. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching. "She doesn't guide," the lieutenant said, almost to herself. "She follows, but that's what makes us move." There was silence for a beat. Then Nathan, breathless, said, "I didn't think I could do that." I replied, "That's because you were taught to wait for someone to tell you when it was time." He looked at his own feet like they belonged to someone else, then up at me. "I don't want to wait anymore." "Then don't," I said. "Just make sure the next step is yours." The rest of the day blurred. More therapy, more notes, brief meetings with the staff. I signed a few forms, agreed to help consult on a new program. But my mind stayed on that sentence. She doesn't guide, she follows. It wasn't meant as praise. Not in the usual sense. But it was the highest honor I could have received. Because in a world built on hierarchy and control, sometimes the most radical thing you can do is choose to walk beside someone. Not to lead, not to fix, but to believe. And let belief do the rest. The hardest part about filing a report isn't gathering the evidence. It's not even writing the summary or organizing the timeline. It's pressing send. Knowing what happens next is no longer in your hands. I submitted the full report on Carson to the Department of Defense Inspector General on a Thursday morning. No ceremony, no press leak, no dramatic confrontation. Just an email with encrypted attachments and a single sentence in the body. Submitted in accordance with Title 10, U.S. Code Section 1034, Military Whistleblower Protection Act, Colonel P. Ward. By noon the next day, they'd confirmed receipt and thanked me for my cooperation in preserving the integrity of institutional conduct. By Monday, Carson was suspended pending investigation. It wasn't public yet, but I knew. Because that afternoon, my phone rang. Not a military line, not an unknown number, it was my mother. She didn't even wait for me to say hello. "What the hell did you do?" Her voice was brittle and cold, the kind of cold that only sounds warm to people who've never been near real fire. "Carson just called," she snapped. "They removed him from his position. No notice, no explanation. Do you understand what this does to his career? To our name?" I took a slow breath, staring out the window of my temporary quarters at Walter Reed. "Mom," I said calmly, "I submitted evidence. I didn't fabricate it. You embarrassed this family, she hissed. You dragged your own brother through the mud, for what? Some spotlight at a gala? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because she still thought this was about a dance. You think I did this to embarrass him? I asked. You think I wanted this? There was a pause, but only for a second. You've always resented him, she said, ever since you were kids. You could never stand not being the favorite. I let that sit. Then I said the only thing I could. Mom, I'm not angry. I'm not even hurt. Then what are you? I'm tired, I said. Tired of pretending silence is the same as peace. Another pause. Then she said it. You're just like your father. And hung up. I didn't call back. I didn't need to. I closed my phone, set it down gently, and went to the file cabinet beside my bed. Pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter. Written by my father 15 years ago, just before his deployment to Ramadi. He never made it back. The letter had nothing heroic in it. No dramatic goodbyes. Just one line that stuck with me. The only thing more dangerous than doing what's right is deciding to stay quiet when you know what's wrong. That night, the Office of the Inspector General released an internal bulletin. Carson's access to DoD systems had been revoked. He was no longer permitted to serve in an advisory role until the full review concluded. It would take weeks, months, maybe. But the wheels were turning. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I went back to the rehab wing the next morning. Nathan was already there, walking laps with another patient. He waved when he saw me. I nodded. The young lieutenant, Alexis, I'd learned her name was, greeted me with a smile. He's getting faster, she said. I looked over at Nathan. He's not just moving, I said. He's choosing. She tilted her head. How'd you get him to start? I didn't, I replied. He led. I followed. She grinned. That's your thing, huh? I smiled back. It works. Later that afternoon, the general found me in the hallway. He didn't mention Carson. He didn't ask about the investigation. He just said, You stood still in a room full of pressure. That's a rare thing. I shrugged. I just made space. He nodded thoughtfully. As I turned to leave, Alexis's voice carried softly from behind me. She doesn't guide. She follows. But that's what makes us move. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. That line would live with me longer than most medals. Because in the end, leadership isn't about volume. It's about presence. And I was finally done being silent. The room wasn't as large as I expected. For a meeting at the Pentagon, called under routine protocol review, it felt oddly intimate. A round table of senior officers, a few department reps, and a glass wall that looked out over the river. No cameras, no microphones. But I knew better. Nothing here was ever just routine. I sat near the far end, in civilian clothes, next to a legal liaison. I wasn't invited to speak, just to attend. Observe. Across from me sat Carson. His suit was crisp, his posture straight, but his eyes flickered when he caught sight of me, just for a second. Then he looked away, like I was an unfortunate smudge on a perfectly planned day. He hadn't expected me here. Good. The chair of the review committee, a 2-star with a quiet demeanor and sharp precision, opened the session by listing procedural matters. I barely listened. My focus was on the folder in his hands, the one with my name on the tab. Eventually, the words landed. As requested by General Harlan Beckett, we have reopened the inquiry into the Ward Lima Forward Operating Report, dated June 14, 2017. Carson flinched. So it was true. General Beckett hadn't just thanked me with words. He'd gone to the department and asked that my combat record be fully reviewed and properly credited. The same report Carson and his allies had tried to weaponize against me. The same report I'd stopped defending years ago because it felt futile to argue with men who had already decided I didn't belong in the field. The chair continued. Today we'll hear from one individual who was present at Forward Operating Post Lima during the incident in question. Carson leaned forward. Not visibly nervous, but alert. The door opened. A woman walked in, early 40s, strong build, wearing a VA badge. Her short hair was streaked with gray, her stride marked by a slight limp. My breath caught. It was Lieutenant Commander Dana Kelso. I hadn't seen her in 6 years. She'd been our surgical lead on the ground. Brilliant under pressure, the kind of woman who didn't ask permission to save lives, just did it and sorted out the politics later. She took the seat across from me, facing the board. Her voice was steady. I served with Colonel Ward at FOB Lima. During the June 14th attack, our unit was cut off for over 8 hours. We had no comms, no reinforcements, no evac window. She looked straight ahead. During that time, Colonel Ward took command of the triage center. She stabilized 9 critical injuries, including 2 abdominal bleeds, a partial amputation, and a collapsed lung. No one died under her care that night. No one spoke. Dana's voice didn't waver. There was a moment around hour 6 when the secondary wall breached. We were overrun. Ward dragged one of the wounded, still on oxygen, back behind the inner defense line while taking shrapnel to her own leg. She refused morphine until everyone else was stable. Carson shifted in his chair. Dana glanced at him, then looked to the board. I've read the redacted report. I've seen what's been circulated about her judgment that night. I'm here to say, without her actions, we would have lost at least half the wounded. Including me, the chair nodded slowly. Why was your statement not included in the initial report? Dana didn't hesitate. I was medevac the next morning and placed in isolation due to infection risk. I submitted my account, but it was delayed in the chain of command. By the time it surfaced, the investigation had already closed. She paused, then added, I didn't know until recently that there was even a question about her performance. The room stilled. Then, for the first time, General Beckett, who had remained silent until now, spoke. He turned to the board. I asked for this review, not because Colonel Ward asked me to. She didn't. He turned toward Carson. I asked for it after watching my son, who hadn't stood unaided in 14 months, walk 6 full steps under her watch. No pity, no stage, just respect. Carson's jaw clenched. Beckett leaned forward. If this institution penalizes integrity because it makes some people uncomfortable, then we're not protecting the uniform, we're burying it. He sat back. Silence again. But this time, it belonged to me. By the time I left the Pentagon that afternoon, the press had already gotten wind of it. Not the full story, not the nuance. Just enough to stir the surface. A headline appeared on a mid-tier defense blog by nightfall. Colonel who danced at Gala now central to Pentagon firestorm. Then another. Decorated medic or reckless officer. Internal review sparks political fallout. The next morning, it hit the majors. I woke to 7 missed calls, 3 voicemails, and a dozen emails from reporters. They wanted quotes, clarifications, reactions. They wanted a face. I gave them none. I didn't schedule interviews. I didn't hold a press conference. I didn't go on morning shows. Instead, I handwrote a letter. It was scanned and sent through the appropriate military channels. Then, per regulation, made available to all registered media upon request. It read, To whom it may concern, I am not a hero. I am not a victim. I am a soldier who made a choice in a moment that mattered. I didn't act for medals. I didn't act for headlines. I acted because someone needed help, and I was there. That's the job. There are people who believe that keeping your head down is the best way to survive in this system. I disagree. Doing the right thing isn't always convenient. It rarely comes with applause, but silence, when faced with harm, is complicity. I've lived long enough in the shadow of that. I do not regret speaking up. I only regret that it took this long to be heard. Colonel Penelope Ward, Army Medical Corps, that was all I said, but it was enough. The following day, the story shifted. Not toward scandal, but toward accountability. Internal audits were launched. Contracts connected to Carson's firm were frozen pending investigation. His security clearance was revoked. Multiple publications quietly amended their earlier coverage, removing language that had painted me as impulsive or unstable. Carson, for his part, remained silent. No rebuttal, no press statement, just absence. It was the first time in his career that power didn't shield him. It was also the first time I realized he didn't know who he was without it. Rumors swirled that his partners were distancing themselves, that his name was no longer being floated for a think tank appointment, that certain connections, ones forged in private clubs and whispered promises, were beginning to fray. And I returned to Walter Reed. Same hallway, same therapy wing, Same faces. Only this time, something had shifted. When I walked into the room, no one stood or saluted. But they watched, not out of curiosity, out of recognition. Nathan was there, helping another young patient adjust their leg brace. He smiled when he saw me. I nodded. In the far corner, Alexis was reviewing paperwork with a visiting therapist. She caught my eye, then tilted her head thoughtfully. "Nice letter," she said. "Too long," I replied. She smirked. "No, just long enough." Later, while walking past the windows that overlooked the rehab garden, I thought about the word everyone kept using, hero. I hated it. Because heroes imply distance, perfection, elevation, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted proximity, connection, ground-level change. I didn't want to be remembered for a headline. I wanted to be remembered for the silence I broke. One of the younger patients approached me before I left that day. He was barely 20. Still wore his pain like armor. He looked at me awkwardly, then said, "Ma'am, did it feel worth it, going up against someone that powerful?" I thought for a moment. Then I answered. It didn't feel like going up. It felt like standing still, while everything else tried to push me backward. He nodded slowly, like he understood. And maybe he did. That evening, alone in my quarters, I received a final notification from the DoD's Office of Oversight. Carson Ward, pending full review, was permanently removed from his advisory roles. His influence had been deemed incompatible with the ethical standards of military partnership. No ceremony, no dramatic downfall, just a name, subtracted. I closed the email, folded my uniform for the next morning, and wrote in my field notebook the only words that mattered now. I didn't raise my voice to be loud, I raised it to be clear. There's a kind of quiet that only happens in recovery rooms, the kind filled not with stillness, but with waiting. Waiting for healing. Waiting for strength. Waiting to believe in either. That morning at Walter Reed, the quiet wasn't heavy. It hummed. Not like something missing, but something unfolding. Nathan was leading group mobility drills in the East Rehab Wing, a space filled with mats, braces, sweat, and encouragement spoken in short, honest bursts. I stood at the back, arms folded, watching him, not as an officer, not even as a mentor, but as a witness to how far he had come. His walk wasn't perfect, still uneven in places, but it was proud, firm, balanced by conviction, not pity. He carried himself like someone who no longer feared falling. The group around him had changed over the last few weeks. Younger soldiers, some barely through their first tours. One wore a carbon fiber leg prosthetic. Another had partial facial reconstruction. None of them looked like anyone's idea of ready, but they were. Not because they had healed fully, but because they had begun. Nathan caught me watching and nodded subtly. Then he turned to his group and said something I hadn't expected. "I took my first step because she didn't push me." He pointed toward me. I knew she could have. She had the rank, the experience, the authority, but she didn't give me orders, she gave me space. That's what saved me. I wasn't prepared for that. It's easier to wear armor when people challenge you, harder when they see you. He looked at a young private in the front row. The kid had just gotten out of surgery a month earlier, below the knee amputation, left side. His face held that look I'd seen too many times, fear pretending to be defiance. Nathan stepped toward him and smiled. "You up for something different today?" The kid hesitated. "Like what?" Nathan walked over to a small speaker in the corner, tapped on his phone, and a soft instrumental began to play. Slow, steady, just rhythm enough to suggest movement. Then Nathan extended his hand. No one spoke. The kid looked around, then at his own leg. "Man, I can't dance," Nathan replied. "Neither could I." The kid blinked. Then, to everyone's surprise, he stood. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't fast, but it was his choice. Nathan didn't lead, he didn't guide, he mirrored. Matched pace. Let the young man falter, regain, and move again. I watched it unfold exactly as it had between Nathan and me weeks earlier. But this time, I wasn't part of it. I wasn't the center. I wasn't the one reaching out. I was the one letting go. And that, I realized, was the point. Recovery isn't about climbing back to where you were. It's about creating space for someone else to rise. When the music ended, Nathan and the kid exchanged a short nod. No clapping, no applause, just a knowing. One of the therapists turned to me and whispered, "He's really becoming something, isn't he?" I nodded. He already is. Later that day, I found Nathan near the courtyard benches, sipping water and adjusting his brace. "Wasn't expecting you to start a dance program," I said. He chuckled. "Wasn't planning on it, but it works." I sat beside him. The autumn breeze picked up. The air smelled like dry leaves and eucalyptus. "Do you remember what you told me that first day?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "I remember you didn't tell me what to do." I smiled. "You said, 'This one hurts.' And I told you that meant it was working." He nodded, looking out at the garden. "Still true," he said. "Hurts less, though." We sat in silence for a while. Then he looked at me and asked, "Do you think I'm ready?" "For what?" "To do what you did for me, for someone else." I met his eyes. "You already are." He looked down at his brace, adjusted the strap, then whispered, almost to himself, "She didn't guide, she followed. But that's what made us move." I didn't reply. That wasn't my line anymore. It belonged to him now. He asked to meet at the old overlook, where we used to ride bikes as kids, where our father would take us after long church Sundays and teach us how to skip rocks down into the canyon. I didn't answer his text right away. I wasn't sure I wanted to go, but I showed up. Not out of obligation, not out of nostalgia, just closure. Carson was already there when I arrived. He stood with his back to me, both hands resting on the railing like he was trying to keep himself from floating away. He didn't turn when I approached, didn't say hello, just stared out over the edge and said, "I used to think you'd always be behind me." I didn't respond. He went on. "You were the kid who colored inside the lines, the one who cried when Mom forgot your birthday. You weren't supposed to outrank me. You weren't supposed to outshine." Finally, he turned. His face looked older than I remembered. Or maybe just heavier. Carson had always carried our family's expectations like medals, but now, they clanged like chains. "I thought if I tore you down early enough, you'd stay manageable," he admitted. His voice didn't shake. It wasn't a confession looking for absolution. It was observation. "I didn't hate you," he added quickly. "I just didn't want you to prove I wasn't special." I let the silence sit between us a moment. Then I said, "You don't have to be special to be good." He scoffed. "Easy for you to say. You've got medals, articles, letters from generals. Me? I'm the one under review." He turned again, staring at the distant trees. Then his voice dropped. "How did you survive it?" I blinked. "Survive what?" He didn't look at me when he asked, "How did you keep living, knowing the family thought you were a burden?" The question hit harder than I expected. It wasn't phrased like a jab. It didn't carry his usual venom. It was raw, genuine. I inhaled, then said carefully, "I lived because I knew I didn't need anyone to lead me to stand." He didn't react at first. Then he leaned against the railing, looking downward as if hoping the ground might respond. "I used to think control was strength," he said quietly. "But the truth is, I was scared. If you succeeded without me, then I had no excuse." I stayed silent. I kept telling myself you were reckless, emotional, naive. But I saw the reports. I saw what you did in Afghanistan, what you did for Nathan. Carson looked over at me. Still no apology in his eyes, but no rage either. Just a man who'd run out of illusions. He said, "I thought leadership was about being followed." I replied, "It's about stepping aside so others can move." A beat passed. Then he asked, "Do you hate me?" The wind stirred around us. I thought about it. About the scars he'd pressed into my years, both with words and the silence that followed them. About the way he rewrote my loyalty into threat. But I also thought about Dad, about our childhood, about the hours we spent building pillow forts and racing to the ice cream truck. And I realized something. "I don't," I said. "But I'm no longer waiting for you to change either." That landed. He nodded once. It wasn't understanding, but maybe acceptance. "I'm leaving the advisory post," he said finally. "It's not official yet, but I don't belong there, not anymore." I didn't offer congratulations or condolences, just stood beside him. One last moment of shared air. He pushed off the railing, brushing invisible dust from his coat. "Well," he muttered, "I guess you turned out all right." Then he walked off. No hug, no farewell. Just footsteps fading into gravel. And for the first time in years, I didn't follow, I stayed. They said the event would be small, just a closed military circle, no cameras, no press. But when I arrived at the base auditorium that morning, I saw rows of uniforms, rows of medals, rows of silence waiting to be filled. The hall smelled like polished wood and formal restraint. Every seat was filled with someone who'd fought, lost, bled, or guided someone back from the brink. Every face carried the weight of what it took to wear that uniform and not crumble beneath it. I hadn't worn my full dress blues since the day I was pinned colonel, but this time I stood differently. Not because of what they were about to give me, but because I had finally let go of needing their permission to stand tall. General Beckett opened the ceremony. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, but softer too. "Today," he said, his voice steady, "we award the Dedicatus honor not just for battlefield courage, but for a deeper kind of valor, one that heals where others destroy, one that dares to restore what war has broken." I stood at attention, but inside I was holding my breath. He continued, "Colonel Penelope Ward didn't just save my son. She reminded a generation of warriors that recovery is not weakness, that the quiet work, done without cameras, without headlines, is sometimes the greatest service of all." His voice cracked ever so slightly. Then he nodded toward me. I stepped forward. The hall rose in a standing ovation. It wasn't thunderous, this wasn't that kind of crowd, but it was deep, grounded, like the air itself was thicker with meaning. He placed the medal around my neck. It was heavy. He leaned in and whispered, "This should have happened years ago. I'm sorry it didn't." I nodded. "It happened when it was needed most, sir." He smiled. The applause continued as I turned to face the crowd. I scanned the room. At the very end of the third row, I saw her, Nathan's mother. She clasped her hands tightly, a tear on her cheek, pride etched across her posture. And then, in the back, farthest row, no dress uniform, no name tag, just a man in a plain suit standing alone. Carson. His shoulders were stiff, his expression unreadable. No one around him acknowledged him. He blended into the wall like a misplaced memory, forgotten, irrelevant. But when my eyes met his, he didn't look away, and for the first time, I saw water in his eyes. Not the kind you fight back out of pride, the kind that comes when something inside you breaks, and you realize it needed to. He didn't nod, didn't smile, but I saw it. The quiet truth behind his silence. He saw me now, not as the sister he tried to reduce, but as the woman who stood tall on her own. The woman who didn't retaliate, but restored. As I walked down from the stage, I passed the aisle where he stood. I didn't stop, but I slowed. Just for half a second. Just enough for him to know I saw him too. Not to forgive, not to forget, but to release. The metal pressed against my chest like a heartbeat. And in that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Not because justice had thundered through the halls, but because it had whispered where it mattered. I was just about to leave the stage when I felt a hand brush against my sleeve. I turned, and there was Nathan. Still in uniform, still walking with a slight tremble in his left leg, but taller somehow, steadier. His shoulders had a purpose now, a weight he no longer feared. "Colonel," he said, voice low so only I could hear. "Today, would you follow me?" I blinked. The room around us blurred out for a second, like the question rewound something deep inside me. The boy who once sat silent in a wheelchair was now the one asking me to follow. I nodded once. Always, Nathan took the lead. I didn't ask where we were going. I just moved behind him, 2 steps back, the way I had once walked behind senior surgeons in war zone triage tents. He walked past the general, past his father, past Beckett's surprised expression that slowly turned to quiet understanding. Nathan walked up to the same podium where I'd just been awarded my medal. He adjusted the mic, then glanced back, just once, to make sure I was still there. Then he began. "My name is Nathan Beckett," he said, voice shaking slightly. "And I want to say something, not as a soldier's son, but as a soldier still becoming. You could have heard a pin drop. I was broken when Colonel Ward found me, not just my spine, my belief, my will, my sense of mattering. He looked out over the sea of faces, all in uniform, all waiting. She didn't fix me, she didn't push me, she didn't even ask me to stand. He paused. She danced with me. People shifted in their seats. She showed me dignity isn't restored by pity or applause, but by being seen, treated not as what you lost, but what you still are. He turned to his left and raised his hand, and from the side aisle, a small group of soldiers began to step forward, one by one. A young woman with a prosthetic arm, a former Marine with tremors, a quiet man whose eyes never quite settled in one place. Each of them moved toward the stage. They didn't march, they didn't salute. They simply took the mic, one by one. I was ready to discharge myself. I didn't believe I deserved care. She sat next to me for 3 hours and didn't say a word, but she was there. I was ashamed to be seen in public. Colonel Ward told me, "You earned every scar. Wear it like a story worth telling." I've never worn long sleeves since. My mother said I should stop calling myself a soldier. Colonel said, "You still are, and you'll always be." Their words didn't shake the walls. They shook something else, quiet and lasting, like soil being turned gently, finally ready for new seeds. I stood there as they spoke, but I didn't step forward. This was not my moment. This was theirs. Each voice, each wound, each halting breath bore testimony to something I had almost forgotten myself. Leadership isn't about commanding. It's about witnessing someone into becoming who they already were. After the last soldier spoke, Nathan turned again to me. No ceremony, no mic. Just that simple look of reverence. "Colonel Ward," he said, "thank you for not rescuing us." I frowned slightly. He smiled. "You let us rescue ourselves." My throat tightened. He held out his hand again, not as a wounded son, not as a recovering soldier, but as a peer. I stepped forward, took his hand. We didn't bow, we didn't salute. We stood there, side by side, surrounded by stories that didn't need headlines to matter. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Slow, measured, purposeful. It built, not into thunder, but into harmony. Like the kind of applause you give at the end of something not flashy, but true. I didn't say anything else. I just looked at Nathan, then the others on stage. And I whispered, "Thank you for letting me follow." Because sometimes, real leaders don't lead. They step aside and trust that those they once held up can carry the torch forward, even brighter. There was no stage this time, no polished podium, no press, no anthem. Just a small clearing behind the rehab center, lit by lanterns strung between oak trees. The light was soft, deliberately imperfect, like a memory you want to keep a little blurry, like it belongs to everyone. We called it a movement gathering, not a ceremony, not a therapy exercise, just a dance. The music wasn't formal. No military march, no ballroom orchestra. Just a playlist of old vinyl rips and new acoustic covers, played from a half-broken speaker someone taped to a wheelchair handle. But the rhythm, it pulsed through us, not loudly, just enough to feel. Nathan was there, of course. He wore a tie that didn't match anything, and boots polished like he still believed medals mattered. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Neither did I. We didn't lead the dance. That wasn't the point. Some of the soldiers stepped forward nervously. Some rolled themselves to the center and just swayed in their chairs. Others held onto partners and moved inches at a time. Every movement was enough. Every inch mattered. Across from me, a young private with 2 prosthetic legs guided her mother in a slow, rotating shuffle. The mother wept the whole time, not out of grief, but because she finally saw her daughter move without needing to prove anything. Behind them, 2 veterans bumped shoulders as they laughed mid-step, tripping over choreography that clearly didn't exist. To my left, one of the older nurses tapped a beat on her cane, teaching a rhythm no one asked to learn, but everyone tried to follow anyway. It was clumsy, and it was beautiful. Then I saw him, standing just outside the circle of lights, Carson. He wasn't wearing a uniform, he didn't walk in. He stood still, his hands deep in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the crowd like he was looking for someone to blame but only finding people healing. He didn't come closer, he just watched. We locked eyes for a moment. I held the gaze. There was no coldness left in me. Not tonight. I didn't wave, I didn't walk toward him. And I didn't need to. Because for once, I knew I didn't owe him anything. Not rage, not grace. Just the space to witness something he could have been part of, but chose not to be. He turned away before the last chorus played. And this time, I didn't feel hollow watching him go. I turned back to the dance, where someone had just started a new song, one that made no sense to waltz to. But that didn't stop anyone. A man with burn scars on half his face twirled a medic who'd once carried his stretcher. She squealed as he spun too fast, but he caught her wrist in time. Someone dropped their cane mid-step. A kid caught it mid-air and grinned like he'd just saved a life. Maybe he did. No applause, just rhythm. Just us. And somewhere inside that barely lit clearing, the past loosened its grip. I stepped into the center, where no one looked at me like a colonel or a sister or a daughter that embarrassed her family name. They just looked at me like someone who dared to dance first. Nathan moved beside me, leaned close. "Colonel?" he asked, smiling. I raised a brow. "Tonight," he whispered, "we dance for you." But I shook my head. "No," I said gently. "Tonight, we dance for us." He nodded. And I let myself be pulled into the rhythm again, not because I needed to be seen, but because I had nothing left to prove. The stars above blinked through the branches, and for a moment, the war in my bones quieted. This wasn't revenge. This was release. This was what healing looked like. Awkward, unscripted, brave, and deeply, deeply human. I used to walk behind people, not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because that's what I was taught. That nurses were support. That our place was behind the scenes, behind the glory, behind the ranks. Even when I earned my commission, even when I wore this uniform, they still said it, softly, sometimes cruelly, sometimes kindly. "You're still just a nurse." But here's what they didn't know. I never needed to be led. Not then. Not now. I learned that one step at a time. I learned it in triage tents soaked with sweat and silence, when no one gave orders and instinct saved lives. I learned it the day I asked a wounded soldier to dance, not because he was ready, but because he deserved to feel seen. I learned it when I kept moving, even when my brother tried to erase me from the narrative, just because I didn't fit the version of soldier he wanted to be associated with. I used to think being dismissed by your own family was the deepest wound. But it wasn't. The real pain was pretending it didn't matter, so I stopped pretending. I stopped waiting for anyone to guide me out of the shadows they built, and by walking forward, on my own, quietly, without spectacle. I didn't just lead others. I led myself out of their narrow gaze. Tonight, under these paper lanterns and bare trees, surrounded by those brave enough to move with trembling limbs and stitched together hearts, I finally see it. Every step we take, no matter how shaky, is a kind of story. Mine is not about medals or defiance or vengeance. It's about becoming. It's about returning to myself. And I hope, wherever you are, whatever your scars or silences, you know that's possible for you too. Before I say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like mine, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care. I'm Colonel Penelope Ward, and I finally know who I am. We'll see each other in the next story. Until then, keep dancing.